The view from the 72nd floor of Grayson Tower had once represented everything Alexander Grayson believed he deserved: power, dominance, the entire city of Chicago sprawling beneath him like a conquered kingdom. But tonight, as federal agents swarmed through his office seizing computers, files, and the last remnants of his dignity, that view meant nothing. Alexander Grayson, you're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The words hit like physical blows. Alexander stood frozen in his custom Italian suit, his mind racing through calculations that no longer mattered. The $8.4 billion empire he'd built over 23 years was collapsing in real time, dismantled by an investigation he'd been too arrogant to take seriously. Outside his office windows, news helicopters circled like vultures. The headline was already written in his mind: Billionaire CEO arrested in massive Ponzi scheme. But here was the truth Alexander would spend the next 6 months learning the hard way. He hadn't known about the fraud. His chief financial officer, Marcus Brennan, had been running an elaborate scheme for 7 years, using shell companies and falsified reports to inflate Grayson Industries' value. Marcus had embezzled $340 million, destroyed thousands of investor portfolios, and when the SEC closed in, he disappeared to the Cayman Islands, leaving Alexander holding the bag. "I didn't do this," Alexander said, his voice hoarse as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. "Marcus Brennan, he's the one you want." The lead agent, a stone-faced woman named Rivera, shook her head. "Save it for your lawyer, Mr. Grayson. You signed every quarterly report. You approved every audit. Ignorance isn't a defense." As they led him through the lobby past employees who'd once scrambled to please him, Alexander felt something he'd never experienced in his 47 years: complete powerlessness. The trial was swift and merciless. Despite his legal team's best efforts, the evidence was overwhelming. Alexander's signature appeared on hundreds of fraudulent documents. His emails showed approval of questionable transactions. The prosecution painted him as a greedy billionaire who'd knowingly destroyed lives for profit. The truth, that he'd been too focused on expansion, too trusting of his CFO, too arrogant to verify what he'd been told, sounded like exactly what it was: the excuse of a man who'd stopped paying attention. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge, an elderly woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many fallen titans, delivered the sentence without emotion. "Alexander Grayson, you are hereby sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years supervised release. You will forfeit all assets acquired through fraudulent means, totaling approximately $3.7 billion. Alexander's world went silent. Everything gone. His penthouse, his cars, his art collection, his reputation, his freedom. All of it seized, liquidated, distributed to victims he'd never known existed. His ex-wife, Vanessa, had divorced him the moment the arrest hit the news, taking their 18-year-old daughter Christina with her. The last words she'd spoken to him echoed in the empty courtroom: "I never knew who you really were. And now neither do you." 6 months into his sentence at FCI Greenville, a minimum security federal prison in Illinois, Alexander had learned several humbling truths. First, money couldn't buy respect from people who saw through your facade. The guards treated everyone the same, with professional indifference. Other inmates didn't care that he'd once owned a skyscraper. Second, the skills that built empires meant nothing when you couldn't even make a decent cup of instant coffee. Third, loneliness in a room full of people was worse than any punishment a judge could deliver. Alexander worked in the prison kitchen, mopping floors and washing dishes alongside men who'd made different mistakes but shared the same fate. He'd gone from commanding boardrooms to scrubbing grease off industrial ovens. One afternoon, while Alexander was alone in the kitchen finishing his shift, Warden Patricia Hayes stopped by. She was a black woman in her early 50s with a reputation for being tough but fair. "Grayson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "you've been keeping your head down. That's smart." Alexander looked up from the sink, water dripping from his rubber gloves. "What choice do I have?" "More than you think." She pulled out a folder. "You've been approved for early work release. You'll serve the rest of your sentence in a halfway house, but you'll need employment. Real employment. No executive positions. No board seats. Manual labor or service industry." The words should have felt like hope, but they landed like another sentencing. "What kind of work?" Alexander asked quietly. Whatever you can get, Warden Hayes replied. You'll report to Crossroads House in downtown Chicago. They'll help you find something. But Grayson? She looked him directly in the eyes. This is your chance to figure out who you are without the money. Don't waste it. Before we continue, let's connect across the world. What time is it where you're watching this right now? And where are you tuning in from? Drop your city, country, and the current time in the comments below. Let's see how far this story of second chances reaches. 3 weeks later, Alexander stood outside Crossroads House wearing donated clothes from Goodwill. Jeans that didn't quite fit, a plain gray t-shirt, and work boots that rubbed blisters on his heels. The halfway house sat in a neighborhood he'd driven past 1,000 times but never actually seen. Cracked sidewalks, corner stores with bars on the windows, people sitting on stoops who looked at him with the same indifference the world had once shown them. Inside, the coordinator, a tired-looking man named Robert Chin, handed Alexander a list of potential jobs. Dishwasher at Mel's Diner. Night janitor at Lincoln Hospital. Warehouse loader at Midwest Distribution. Pick one. Alexander scanned the list, each option a universe away from the corner office he'd once commanded. What about something in finance? I have experience. Nobody's hiring a convicted felon for finance work, Robert interrupted, not unkindly. You need to understand something, Grayson. The world doesn't owe you a second chance. You have to earn it. Alexander chose the diner. At least he'd be around people instead of mopping empty hallways alone at 2 a.m. Mel's Diner sat on the corner of Madison and Wells, a 50-year-old establishment with cracked vinyl booths, a perpetually broken jukebox, and the smell of burnt coffee permanently embedded in the walls. The owner, Melvin Mel Rodriguez, was a stocky man in his 60s who'd bought the place in 1998 and refused to modernize anything except the health code violations. You're the ex-billionaire, Mel said flatly when Alexander arrived for his interview. Yes, sir. You know how to wash dishes? I learned in prison. Mel grunted. $6 an hour, cash. You show up on time, you work hard, we won't have problems. You show up late or steal from me, you're gone. Clear? Crystal. Good. Start tomorrow. 5 a.m. Alexander's first shift began in darkness. The diner opened at 5:30 a.m. for the early crowd. Construction workers, night shift nurses, cab drivers grabbing coffee before heading home. He stood at the industrial sink in the back kitchen, a mountain of greasy plates stacked beside him, steam rising from scalding water that turned his hands raw within the first hour. The head cook, a no-nonsense woman named Luisa, barked orders in Spanish and broken English, treating Alexander with the same gruff efficiency she showed everyone. There were no special considerations for the man who'd once owned a private jet. But it was the waitress who would change everything. Her name was Sophie Miller, and she moved through the diner like someone who'd learned to carry the weight of the world on a smile. 32 years old, with dark blonde hair pulled into a perpetual ponytail and eyes that flickered between exhaustion and determination, Sophie worked the morning shift 6 days a week. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Emma, a mountain of medical debt, and dreams she'd stopped talking about years ago. Alexander noticed her immediately, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because she was kind to everyone. The grumpy construction worker who never tipped got the same warm greeting as the elderly couple who left 20%. The homeless man who nursed a single cup of coffee for 3 hours got his refills without judgment. She noticed Alexander too, but not the way most people did. While others whispered about the billionaire washing dishes, Sophie simply said, "Morning, new guy. Coffee's on the counter when you need it. Don't let Louisa see you taking breaks, but she's got a soft spot if you work hard." "Thanks," Alexander muttered, unsure how to process kindness that expected nothing in return. "No problem," Sophie replied, already moving to the next table, her notepad ready. The days blurred together. Alexander woke at 4 a.m. in his tiny room at the halfway house, took the bus to the diner, scrubbed dishes for 8 hours, then returned to his room to stare at the ceiling and wonder how his life had come to this. But slowly something shifted. He started noticing the rhythm of the diner, how Mel always gave free meals to the cops on patrol, how Louisa snuck extra bacon to the single moms who looked particularly tired, how Sophie remembered every regular's order without writing it down. He heard conversations he'd never paid attention to before. The construction worker talking about his daughter's college acceptance. The nurse mentioning her son's deployment to Afghanistan. The elderly couple celebrating 63 years of marriage with pancakes and weak coffee. These were the invisible people, Alexander realized. The ones he'd driven past in his Bentley, whose labor had built the buildings he'd owned, whose pensions he'd destroyed. And Sophie was their guardian angel, moving through chaos with grace. One morning, about 3 weeks into his employment, the diner's credit card system crashed during the breakfast rush. The line of customers backed up to the door. Mel was swearing in Spanish, slamming the ancient machine that refused to process payments. Alexander dried his hands and walked out of the kitchen. "Can I take a look?" Mel glared. "You know how to fix this?" "I built my first company on payment processing systems," Alexander said quietly. "I might remember a few things." 15 minutes later, the system was running. Alexander had identified a corrupted software update, manually rolled it back, and rerouted the processing through a backup server Mel didn't even know existed. Sophie watched from across the counter, a coffee pot in one hand, something like curiosity lighting her tired eyes. "That was impressive," she said when the rush died down. Alexander shrugged. "Just problem solving." Most people would have let Mel struggle and gone back to the dishes. "I'm not most people." Sophie smiled, and for the first time since his arrest, Alexander felt something other than shame. "No," she agreed softly, "I don't think you are." Over the following weeks, Sophie and Alexander developed a quiet friendship built on early mornings and stolen conversations during slow periods. She learned he had a daughter he hadn't spoken to in 9 months. He learned she'd gotten pregnant at 24, that Emma's father had left before the baby was born, that she'd been working 2 jobs ever since. "Don't you get tired?" Alexander asked one morning as she refilled ketchup bottles at 6 a.m. "Every single day," Sophie admitted. "But tired doesn't pay Emma's medical bills or keep the lights on. So I keep moving." "Medical bills?" Sophie's expression flickered with pain. "She has juvenile diabetes. Insulin costs about $400 a month, even with insurance. I'm behind on 3 months of payments. The clinic's been patient, but..." She trailed off, forcing brightness back into her voice. "But we manage. We always do." Alexander felt something crack open in his chest. Here was a woman working herself to exhaustion for $2.33 an hour plus tips, raising a sick child alone, and she still smiled at strangers. "Sophie," he said slowly, "what if there was a way to..." "Don't," she interrupted gently. "I know you probably have ideas, business solutions, whatever. But I don't need saving. I just need to keep working." He nodded, but the wheels in his mind were already turning. That night, Alexander lay awake in his halfway house bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't consumed with self-pity or anger at Marcus Brennan. He was thinking about insulin costs, about payment processing systems, about a waitress who deserved better than the hand life had dealt her. And he was remembering something Warden Hayes had said: "Figure out who you are without the money." Maybe, Alexander thought, he was about to find out. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the diner earlier than usual. Mel was in the back office, surrounded by stacks of bills and receipts, muttering curses in Spanish. "What's wrong?" Alexander asked from the doorway. Mel looked up, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Supplier raised prices again. Utilities are up. Property taxes due next month. This place is bleeding money, and I don't know how much longer I can keep it open." Alexander stepped into the cramped office. "Can I see your books?" Mel hesitated, then shoved a folder across the desk. "You an accountant now too?" "Close enough." For the next hour, Alexander analyzed Mel's finances with the same precision he'd once applied to billion-dollar mergers. The diner was losing money, but not because of the obvious reasons. "Your suppliers are overcharging you by about 30%, Alexander said finally. "Your inventory management is costing you thousands in waste. And you're paying for services you don't need." Mel blinked. "So what do I do?" "Let me make some calls. I still remember a few people who owe me favors." Over the next 2 weeks, Alexander quietly restructured Mel's entire operation. He negotiated better rates with suppliers, streamlined the inventory system, and eliminated unnecessary expenses. The diner's monthly losses turned into modest profits. Mel looked at the updated spreadsheets in disbelief. "You just saved my business." "You gave me a job when no one else would," Alexander replied simply. Consider it payback. But Alexander's real project was still forming in his mind. Late one night, he sat at the public library computer, researching pharmaceutical pricing, insulin manufacturers, and pharmacy assistance programs. What he discovered made his blood boil. The cost of producing insulin was about $5 per vial. Manufacturers charged $300. Insurance companies negotiated rates that still left patients like Emma paying hundreds out of pocket. It was a system designed to profit from suffering, and it was legal. Alexander knew he couldn't change the entire healthcare system. But maybe he could help one little girl. He began reaching out to contacts from his old life, people who'd known him before the scandal, who remembered the Alexander Grayson who'd built businesses instead of destroying them. Most didn't respond. His name was still toxic. But one did. Dr. James Chin, a pharmaceutical executive Alexander had mentored 15 years ago, agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. "Alexander," James said, studying him carefully, "you look different. Prison has a way of changing perspective." James smiled faintly. "I heard you're washing dishes now. Best job I've ever had." That answer seemed to satisfy something in James's eyes. "What do you need?" Alexander explained Sophie's situation, Emma's diabetes, the impossible cost of staying alive. "I can't give you money," Alexander said. "I don't have any. But you run patient assistance programs. Is there any way?" "I'll make it happen," James interrupted. "Emma Miller gets her insulin free for as long as she needs it. Consider it done." Alexander felt tears prickling his eyes for the first time since his sentencing. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," James said quietly. "Just keep being this version of yourself. The world needs fewer billionaires and more people who give a damn." The next morning, Alexander arrived at the diner to find Sophie in tears behind the counter. "What's wrong?" he asked, panic rising. She held up her phone, voice breaking. "The clinic just called. Someone set up an assistance program for Emma. Her insulin is covered. All of it. For free." She looked at him, mascara running down her cheeks, and for a moment Alexander thought she knew. "Someone out there is an angel," Sophie whispered. "I don't know who, but someone actually cares." Alexander turned back to his dishes, hiding his smile. "Yeah," he said softly. "Someone does." But what neither of them knew was that Alexander's old life was about to come crashing back in the worst possible way. Because Marcus Brennan, the man who'd framed him, had just returned to Chicago. And he wasn't finished destroying Alexander Grayson yet. Marcus Brennan had always been good at two things: making money disappear and making people believe whatever story served him best. For 7 years, he'd embezzled $340 million from Grayson Industries through a web of shell companies, falsified audits, and carefully constructed lies. When the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation got too close, he transferred the remaining funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands, destroyed the evidence trail, and left Alexander Grayson's signature on every incriminating document. Then he'd vanished to a beachfront villa in Grand Cayman, sipping rum while Alexander rotted in federal prison for crimes Marcus had committed. But Marcus had made one critical mistake. He'd gotten bored. 18 months of tropical paradise, endless money, and zero accountability had left him restless. The thrill wasn't in having wealth, it was in taking it from others, in watching empires crumble, in being the smartest person in the room. So Marcus returned to Chicago under a false identity, Thomas Brennan, a venture capitalist from Boston looking for investment opportunities in struggling businesses. His first target was obvious: Mel's Diner. Marcus had been monitoring Alexander's movements through private investigators ever since his release to the halfway house. He knew where Alexander worked, who he talked to, what pathetic life he'd scraped together from the ashes. And Marcus knew exactly how to destroy him all over again. 3 days after Alexander had arranged Emma's insulin assistance, a man in an expensive charcoal suit walked into Mel's Diner at precisely 10:30 a.m., when the breakfast rush had ended and the lunch crowd hadn't yet arrived. Sophie was wiping down tables. Alexander was in the back kitchen scrubbing the industrial grill. Mel was in his office reviewing the improved financial statements Alexander had created. The man sat at the counter, his movements precise and controlled. When Sophie approached with a menu and coffee pot, he smiled with the practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to weaponize charm. "Good morning," Sophie said, her standard greeting carrying genuine friendliness. "Coffee to start? Please." His voice was smooth, cultured, the accent carefully neutral. "And I'd like to speak with the owner when he has a moment. I have a business proposition." Sophie poured the coffee, curiosity flickering across her face. "I'll let Mel know. Can I tell him what it's regarding?" "Investment opportunities," the man replied, handing her a business card that read, "Thomas Brennan, Venture Capital, Brennan Holdings, LLC." "I'll be right back," Sophie said, heading toward the office. In the kitchen, Alexander was lost in the rhythm of scrubbing, his mind half on the grill and half on the conversation he'd had with Sophie that morning. She told him that Emma's first batch of free insulin had arrived, that her daughter had cried happy tears, that Sophie herself hadn't slept all night because she kept waking up to make sure it was real. "Someone out there believes in second chances," Sophie had said, her eyes bright with gratitude Alexander couldn't accept. "Maybe the world isn't as broken as I thought." Alexander had smiled and changed the subject, uncomfortable with praise for something that felt like the bare minimum of human decency. Now, as he scraped carbonized grease from the grill's surface, Mel's voice called from the doorway. "Grayson, come out here a second. Need your opinion on something." Alexander dried his hands and walked into the dining area, still wearing his grease-stained apron and rubber gloves. Then he saw the man at the counter and his entire world stopped. Marcus Brennan sat there, coffee cup raised halfway to his lips, his eyes locked on Alexander with an expression of pure malicious delight. "Alexander Grayson," Marcus said, his voice loud enough to carry through the diner. "What a remarkable coincidence. I had no idea you were working here." The name hit the quiet diner like a gunshot. Sophie's head snapped up from the table she was wiping. Louisa emerged from the kitchen, her eyes wide. Mel froze in his office doorway. Alexander stood paralyzed, staring at the man who'd destroyed his life, feeling the carefully rebuilt foundation beneath his feet begin to crack. "You," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me," Marcus agreed pleasantly. "It's been 9 months since your sentencing? You're looking well. Dishwashing agrees with you." Sophie moved closer, her protective instincts flaring at the obvious tension. "Do you two know each other?" Marcus laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Know each other? Oh, Sophie, it is Sophie, isn't it? Alexander and I go way back. He was my boss at Grayson Industries before the unfortunate legal troubles. Such a shame how it all ended." Alexander found his voice, cold and steady despite the rage building in his chest. "You framed me." "Careful, Alexander," Marcus said, his smile never faltering. "Defamation is a serious accusation, especially from a convicted felon." Mel stepped forward, his stocky frame radiating protectiveness. "I don't know what history you two have, but this is my diner. If there's going to be trouble—" "No trouble at all," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "In fact, I came here with a generous offer. I'm interested in purchasing this establishment. I'm prepared to offer $400,000 cash, well above market value for a struggling business in this neighborhood." The number hung in the air. Mel's diner, with all its cracked vinyl and burnt coffee smells, was worth maybe $150,000 on a good day. "Why?" Mel asked suspiciously. "Prime location," Marcus replied easily. "I'm developing a portfolio of properties in gentrifying neighborhoods. Your corner lot has potential." But Alexander saw the truth in Marcus's eyes. This wasn't about real estate. This was about destroying the one small piece of stability Alexander had found. "Don't sell to him," Alexander said quietly. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting advice from someone who's only been here a few weeks. Tell me, Alexander, have you been honest with these good people about who you are? About what you did?" Sophie looked between them, confusion and dawning realization crossing her face. "What is he talking about?" "Alexander Grayson," Marcus announced to the diner, his voice carrying theatrical weight, defrauded thousands of investors out of billions of dollars. He destroyed retirement accounts, college funds, life savings. He's a convicted criminal serving the remainder of his sentence in a halfway house. The words settled over the diner like toxic smoke. The few customers present looked up from their meals. Louisa crossed herself. Mel's expression shifted from protective to uncertain. "That's not the whole story," Alexander said, his voice shaking. "No." Marcus's smile widened. "Then please enlighten us. Tell them about the falsified quarterly reports, the shell companies, the billions that disappeared while you lived in your penthouse and flew on private jets." You created those shell companies, Alexander said, desperation creeping into his voice. You falsified the reports. You embezzled the money and left me to take the fall. Marcus spread his hands in mock innocence. If that were true, why am I free while you're washing dishes? The court saw the evidence, Alexander. They saw your signature on every fraudulent document. Justice was served. Sophie stepped closer to Alexander, her eyes searching his face. Is it true? Did you steal from people? Alexander wanted to deny it, to explain the complexity of what had happened, but the simple answer was the only honest one. The court said I did. I went to prison for it. He watched something break in Sophie's expression. The trust, the friendship they'd been building, it crumbled in real time. I need to get back to work, she said quietly, turning away. Sophie, wait. Don't, she said without looking back. Just don't. Marcus stood, placing exact change on the counter. Think about my offer, Mr. Rodriguez. I'll return tomorrow for your answer. Oh, and Alexander? He paused at the door. It's good to see you found your appropriate station in life. Some people are meant to lead. Others are meant to serve. Then he was gone, leaving wreckage in his wake. If you can't stand people like Marcus Brennan who destroy innocent lives and then mock their victims, hit that subscribe button right now. Only manipulators and con artists who protect their own kind won't subscribe. Show that you stand against those who weaponize the system for personal gain. The rest of Alexander's shift passed in suffocating silence. Sophie avoided him completely, taking tables on the opposite side of the diner. Mel retreated to his office without a word. Even Louisa, who normally barked cheerful insults, worked in tense quiet. When Alexander's shift ended at 2 p.m., he removed his apron slowly, folded it with mechanical precision, and walked out into the Chicago afternoon sun. He made it 3 blocks before his legs gave out. He sat on a bus stop bench, head in his hands, feeling the weight of his past crushing down on the fragile present he'd tried to build. His phone buzzed. A text from his parole officer. Heard about an incident at your workplace. Need to meet tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late. Word traveled fast in the system. One whiff of trouble and they'd send him back to finish his sentence behind bars. Alexander's phone buzzed again. This time an unknown number. We should talk. There's more to this story. His heart jumped. Sophie. He texted back. Where? Her response came immediately. Lou's Coffee Shop, corner of State and Harrison. 7 p.m. Alexander spent the intervening hours at the public library, researching everything he could find about Thomas Brennan and Brennan Holdings LLC. The company existed, registered in Delaware 3 months ago. The business address traced to a virtual office. The website was professional but vague, listing diversified investments and strategic acquisitions without specifics. It was a shell, exactly the kind Marcus had used to embezzle from Grayson Industries. Alexander dug deeper, using old contacts and half-remembered passwords to access databases he probably shouldn't have touched. He found property records showing that Brennan Holdings had purchased 4 other struggling businesses in the past 2 months. A laundromat, a corner grocery, a small printing shop, and a dry cleaner. All of them had closed within weeks of the acquisition. All of them had been demolished to make way for luxury developments. Marcus wasn't just targeting Mel's diner. He was systematically destroying the neighborhood's small businesses, buying them cheap and flipping the land to developers for massive profits. And he was using Alexander's presence to pressure Mel into selling. At 6:55 p.m., Alexander walked into Lou's Coffee Shop, a hole-in-the-wall establishment that smelled like burned espresso and old books. Sophie sat in the back corner, a cup of tea cooling in front of her. She changed out of her work uniform into jeans and a faded Northwestern sweatshirt. Without the forced brightness she wore at the diner, she looked exhausted and wary. Alexander slid into the seat across from her. Thank you for meeting me. I'm not here because I trust you, Sophie said bluntly. I'm here because I need to understand what's happening. That man today, there was something wrong about him. The way he smiled while destroying you. It felt personal. It is personal, Alexander said quietly. Marcus Brennan was my CFO at Grayson Industries. For 7 years, he embezzled hundreds of millions of dollars through shell companies and falsified audits. When the SEC investigation closed in, he framed me for everything and disappeared to the Cayman Islands. Sophie listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. I didn't know what he was doing, Alexander continued. I was too focused on expansion, too trusting, too arrogant to verify what I was being told. I signed documents without reading them carefully. I approved transactions based on reports he'd fabricated. Legally, that made me culpable. Morally, he paused, searching for honesty. I was guilty of negligence, of hubris, of not caring enough to protect the people whose money we were managing. But you didn't steal the money yourself, Sophie said slowly. No. But I created the environment where Marcus could. I prioritized growth over accountability. I built a company culture where questioning authority was discouraged. In a way, I built the weapon he used to destroy everything. Sophie wrapped her hands around her teacup. Why is he here now? Why target Mel's diner? Because he can't resist twisting the knife, Alexander said bitterly. Because destroying me once wasn't enough. He wants me to watch as he takes away the one place I've found some stability. Or, Sophie said, her voice sharp with the kind of clarity that comes from years of survival, he's here because he's still stealing and he doesn't want you figuring it out. Alexander looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? I waited tables for 8 years before Emma was born and 6 years after, Sophie explained. I've seen every kind of con artist who walks through a diner door. That man today wasn't here to buy Mel's place. He was here to scare Mel into selling cheap so he could flip it for profit. Classic gentrification scam. She pulled out her phone, showing Alexander a news article. I did some research after my shift. There's a proposed development project for this neighborhood. Luxury condos, upscale retail. The developers need to acquire multiple properties on this block. Your friend Marcus has been buying them up and reselling at triple the price. Alexander stared at the article, his mind racing through implications. He's running another fraud scheme. Using intimidation and market manipulation to force sales. And he's using you to do it, Sophie added. By exposing your past, making Mel afraid to keep you employed, Marcus creates pressure to sell and get away from the scandal. I should quit, Alexander said heavily. If my presence is making Mel vulnerable. Don't you dare, Sophie interrupted fiercely. That's exactly what Marcus wants. You walk away, Mel sells because he's scared, Marcus wins again. So what do I do? Sophie met his eyes, and for the first time since the diner confrontation, Alexander saw something other than suspicion in her gaze. He saw determination. You fight back, she said simply. You prove Marcus is running another scam. You expose him before he can hurt anyone else. I'm a convicted felon on parole, Alexander said. Who's going to believe me? Then don't make it about you, Sophie replied. Make it about the evidence. They spent the next 3 hours in that coffee shop, Alexander's old corporate instincts awakening as he and Sophie pieced together Marcus's operation. The shell company. The rapid property acquisitions. The suspicious timing of Mel's generous offer. The pattern matched Marcus's previous fraud exactly. Complex enough to obscure criminal intent, simple enough to execute quickly. We need proof he's the same Marcus Brennan who embezzled from Grayson Industries, Sophie said. Financial records, DNA, something that connects Thomas to Marcus. I know someone who might help, Alexander said slowly. James Chin, the pharmaceutical executive who arranged Emma's insulin assistance. He has resources, connections. If I explain what's happening. You got Emma's insulin? Sophie interrupted, her eyes widening. Alexander realized his mistake too late. I asked an old contact for help. I couldn't stand watching you work yourself to exhaustion while your daughter suffered. For a long moment, Sophie just stared at him. Then, to his complete surprise, she started crying. Sophie, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to overstep. You saved my daughter's life, Sophie said through tears. Do you understand that? 3 months of unpaid insulin bills were going to bankrupt me. I was going to lose our apartment. I was this close to losing Emma to state custody because I couldn't afford her medication. She reached across the table and grabbed his hands. You're not the man Marcus described. You're not the man the news reported. You're someone who washes dishes and arranges insulin for sick children when you have nothing to gain. Alexander felt something break open in his chest, not the sharp pain of shame, but the aching warmth of being truly seen. I'm trying to be better than I was, he said quietly. You already are, Sophie replied. The moment was interrupted by Alexander's phone buzzing. A text from an unknown number. "Stop digging into my business or Sophie's daughter has an accident. People who can't afford insulin shouldn't test their luck." Alexander's blood turned to ice. He showed Sophie the message, watching her face go pale. "He knows about Emma's insulin," Sophie whispered. "He knows we're investigating him." "I'm calling the police," Alexander said, reaching for his phone. "And tell them what?" Sophie asked, her voice shaking. "That a legitimate businessman sent a vaguely threatening text? They'll dismiss it and Marcus will know we're scared." She was right. Alexander had learned in prison that the system protected those who understood how to manipulate it. Marcus had already proven he could destroy lives while maintaining plausible deniability. "Then what do we do?" Alexander asked. Sophie's jaw set with the same determination he'd seen when she worked double shifts to pay for Emma's medication. "We get the proof we need. Fast. Before Marcus can hurt anyone." That night, Alexander lay awake in his halfway house bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything he stood to lose. His parole could be revoked for associating with Sophie in what might be deemed vigilante investigation. His job at the diner was hanging by a thread. His fragile reputation was destroyed again. But for the first time since his arrest, Alexander wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he still had the power to protect. A 7-year-old girl who needed insulin to survive. A single mother who'd shown him more kindness than he deserved. An elderly restaurant owner who'd given him a second chance. A community of invisible people Marcus would crush without a second thought. Alexander pulled out his phone and texted James Chin. "Need to meet. Urgent. Lives at stake." The response came within minutes. "Tomorrow, 6 a.m., my office. Bring everything you have." As Alexander finally drifted toward sleep, he thought about what Warden Hayes had told him. "Figure out who you are without the money." He was starting to understand. Without the money, the power, the reputation, stripped down to nothing but his choices, Alexander Grayson was becoming someone he could finally respect. Someone who wouldn't let Marcus Brennan destroy innocent lives ever again. The next morning, Alexander met James Chin in the executive offices of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, a gleaming tower that represented everything Alexander had once taken for granted. James listened without interrupting as Alexander laid out the evidence. Marcus's shell company, the property acquisitions, the intimidation tactics, the threatening text about Emma. When Alexander finished, James leaned back in his leather chair, his expression grave. "You're asking me to help you expose a fraud scheme when you're a convicted fraudster yourself. You understand the optics." "I do," Alexander said. "But this isn't about me. It's about stopping Marcus before he destroys more lives." James studied him for a long moment. "What changed you, Alexander? The man I knew 10 years ago wouldn't have risked everything for a waitress and her daughter." "I lost everything," Alexander said simply. "And then I found people who helped me anyway. Sophie didn't know who I was, didn't care about my money or connections. She was just kind because kindness is who she is. That taught me more than any prison sentence could." James nodded slowly. "I'll help. But we do this carefully. Legally. No vigilante justice." "Agreed." Over the next 3 days, James mobilized resources Alexander could only dream of. Private investigators documented Marcus's property transactions. Forensic accountants analyzed Brennan Holdings' financial records. A cybersecurity team traced digital footprints linking Thomas Brennan to Marcus Brennan's old email accounts. The evidence mounted systematically. Falsified business licenses, shell company transactions mirroring his previous fraud patterns, communications with developers discussing property manipulation. But they needed one final piece, definitive proof that Thomas and Marcus were the same person. "DNA would do it," James said during their strategy session. "But we can't legally obtain a sample without his consent or a warrant." Alexander remembered something from his trial. Marcus has a scar on his left hand from a boating accident in 2015. It's distinctive, shaped like a crescent moon. If we can photograph it, we can match it to old photos from your company records, James finished. "Get the photo. We'll handle the rest." That evening, Alexander returned to Mel's diner for his regular shift, acutely aware that Marcus could appear at any moment. Sophie worked the floor with renewed purpose, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. Mel had grown quiet and withdrawn, the weight of Marcus's offer and Alexander's exposed past pressing down on his shoulders. At exactly 10:30 a.m., Marcus walked through the door. This time he wasn't alone. Two men in expensive suits flanked him, lawyers Alexander guessed or hired muscle disguised as legal counsel. "Mr. Rodriguez," Marcus said pleasantly, "have you considered my offer?" Mel emerged from his office, his face lined with exhaustion. "I need more time." "Time is a luxury in real estate," Marcus replied. "My offer expires today. $400,000 cash, or I walk away and let market forces handle your struggling business." "Market forces you're manipulating," Alexander said quietly from the kitchen doorway. Marcus turned, his smile sharpening. "Alexander, still here? I thought surely you'd have moved on by now. Found another charity case to pretend you're helping." "I'm exactly where I need to be." "How noble," Marcus sneered. "The fallen billionaire playing working-class hero. Tell me, have you confessed to Sophie about the pension funds you destroyed? The families whose retirements vanished because of your greed?" Sophie appeared from the back, her voice steady despite the tension. "He told me everything. Unlike you, he takes responsibility for his mistakes." Marcus laughed. "Responsibility? He's a convicted felon washing dishes. That's not responsibility, that's consequences." "Which you've never faced," Alexander said, stepping closer. "But that's about to change." Marcus's expression flickered, just for a moment, with uncertainty. "Careful, Alexander. Threats from convicted criminals carry weight with parole boards." "Not a threat," Alexander replied calmly. "A promise. The truth always surfaces eventually. And when it does, everyone will know what you really are." Marcus studied him for a long moment, then turned back to Mel. "Final offer, Mr. Rodriguez. $400,000, or I'll make sure every bank in Chicago knows you're employing a convicted fraudster. Let's see how your business loans survive that publicity." Mel's face went pale. Alexander felt his stomach drop. Marcus had found the leverage he needed. Before anyone could respond, the diner door opened again. James Chin walked in, followed by two FBI agents. Marcus's face went white. "What is this?" "Marcus Brennan," one of the agents announced, "you're under arrest for wire fraud, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud." As the agents moved forward with handcuffs, Marcus's composure finally cracked. "This is insane. I'm Thomas Brennan, a legitimate businessman." "Save it," the second agent interrupted. "We have forensic evidence linking you to shell companies, falsified business documents, and communications proving you've been running a property manipulation scheme." They cuffed him efficiently, reading his rights while Marcus sputtered denials and threats. As they led him toward the door, Marcus locked eyes with Alexander one final time. The malicious confidence was gone, replaced by impotent rage. "This isn't over," Marcus hissed. "Yes," Alexander said quietly, "it is." The diner erupted in chaos as Marcus was escorted out. Customers whispered. Louisa crossed herself again. Mel stood frozen in disbelief. Sophie crossed to Alexander, her eyes shining. "You did it." "We did it," he corrected. James approached, extending his hand. "The FBI had been investigating Brennan Holdings for 2 months. Your evidence gave them everything they needed for the arrest warrant." "What happens now?" Alexander asked. "Marcus faces federal charges," James explained. "If convicted, he's looking at 15 to 20 years. More importantly, the investigation will likely exonerate you on the original Grayson Industries charges. The evidence shows Marcus acted alone." The words took a moment to register. "Exonerate? You mean I could be cleared?" "It won't be immediate," James cautioned. "But yes, with Marcus's arrest and the new evidence, your attorneys can file for appeal. It could take months, maybe a year, but there's a real chance you'll be vindicated." Alexander sat down heavily in the nearest booth, the weight of 2 years of shame and anger suddenly lifting. Sophie slid in across from him, reaching for his hand. "You okay?" "I don't know," he admitted. "I spent so long accepting that I was guilty, that I deserved everything that happened. Now you get to rebuild," Sophie said softly. "For real this time." Mel approached, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Grayson, I'm sorry. I should have trusted you." "You didn't know me," Alexander said. "You took a chance hiring me at all. That's more than most people would do." "About that," Mel said, a slight smile breaking through. "How would you feel about a promotion?" Turns out I need a business manager. Someone good with numbers and suppliers and keeping this place profitable. Alexander looked around the diner, the cracked vinyl, the burnt coffee smell, the honest work and honest people. It wasn't Grayson Tower. It was better. I'd be honored, he said. That night, Sophie invited Alexander to dinner at her apartment. It was small, cramped, filled with Emma's drawings and medical supplies, but warm with the kind of love Alexander had never known in his penthouse. Emma, a tiny girl with Sophie's bright eyes and a medical alert bracelet on her wrist, eyed Alexander with the suspicion only 7-year-olds can muster. "You're the man who got my medicine," she said matter-of-factly. "I just made some calls," Alexander replied, kneeling to her eye level. "But I'm glad it helped." Emma studied him seriously. "Mommy says you're a good person who made mistakes. Is that true?" "Very true. Mommy makes mistakes sometimes too," Emma said. "Like when she burns dinner. But she's still the best mommy." Alexander smiled. "Your mom is pretty amazing." "I know," Emma agreed, then ran off to her room to get her favorite book. Sophie touched Alexander's shoulder. "She likes you. That's rare. She's a smart kid." "She is." Sophie's expression grew serious. "Alexander, what happens when your name is cleared? When you're not a convicted felon anymore? Do you go back to your old life?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Alexander was only beginning to understand. "I don't have an old life to go back to," he said slowly. "Grayson Industries is gone. My reputation, even if legally cleared, is permanently damaged. My wife left me, my daughter won't speak to me. Everything I built was either fake or destroyed. So what do you want now?" Alexander looked around the small apartment, the hand-me-down furniture, the stack of medical bills on the counter, the sound of Emma singing to herself in the next room. "This," he said quietly. "I want this. Real work. Real people. A chance to build something that actually matters." Sophie's eyes glistened. "That's good. Because I was really hoping you'd stay." Before Alexander could respond, Emma returned with her book, a worn copy of The Giving Tree. "Will you read it to me?" she asked, climbing into his lap with the unconscious trust of children who haven't yet learned to doubt. Alexander read, his voice catching on the familiar words about giving and sacrifice and finding purpose in helping others. When Emma fell asleep against his chest, Sophie carefully lifted her and carried her to bed. She returned to find Alexander still sitting there, staring at the book in his hands. "You okay?" she asked. "I spent 23 years building an empire," Alexander said softly. "Accumulating billions, conquering markets, proving I was smarter than everyone else. And none of it meant anything." He looked up at Sophie. "But this, reading a bedtime story to your daughter, working an honest job at Mel's, helping people without expecting anything in return, this is the first time I felt like my life actually mattered." Sophie sat beside him, their shoulders touching. "Maybe you needed to lose everything to find what was important." "Maybe," Alexander agreed. "Or maybe I needed someone to show me what important looks like." They sat in comfortable silence, two broken people who'd found unexpected wholeness in each other's damaged pieces. Outside, the Chicago night settled over the city, the same city where Alexander had once commanded towers and conquered markets, now offering him something far more valuable: redemption, purpose, and the quiet grace of a second chance. Tomorrow he would return to the diner, scrub dishes, and help Mel rebuild a business worth saving. But tonight he was exactly where he needed to be. The legal process of clearing Alexander Grayson's name moved with the kind of bureaucratic slowness that tested every ounce of patience he developed washing dishes. His attorney, Margaret Foster, a public defender who'd taken his appeal pro bono after reviewing the new evidence, explained it during their first meeting at the Cook County Courthouse. "The FBI's arrest of Marcus Brennan opens the door for your exoneration, but it's not automatic," Margaret said, spreading documents across the scarred table in the consultation room. "We need to file a motion to vacate your conviction based on newly discovered evidence. Then there's a hearing, review by the original judge, possible retrial if the prosecution contests." "How long?" Alexander asked. 6 months minimum. Maybe a year." Alexander nodded slowly. A year ago the timeline would have felt like torture. Now, with honest work at the diner and Sophie's steady presence in his life, he could wait. "Do it right," he said. "I don't want this overturned on technicalities." I want my name completely cleared. Margaret smiled. That's what I like to hear. Over the following weeks, Alexander maintained his routine with almost meditative focus. Wake at 4 a.m., arrive at Mel's by 5, work until 2 p.m., then split his time between the halfway house requirements and helping Mel restructure the diner's business model. The promotion to business manager came with a modest salary increase, enough that Alexander could finally afford to buy Sophie and Emma a proper dinner at a restaurant nicer than the diner. He chose a small Italian place in Lincoln Park, nothing fancy, but clean and warm with checkered tablecloths and breadsticks that Emma devoured with 7-year-old enthusiasm. This is really nice, Sophie said, looking around with the careful appreciation of someone unaccustomed to spending money on anything beyond necessities. You deserve nice things, Alexander replied quietly. Emma kicked her legs under the table, her medical alert bracelet catching the candlelight. Mr. Alexander, are you my mom's boyfriend? Sophie choked on her water. Emma? It's okay, Alexander said, smiling at the girl's directness. That's a fair question. Emma, I care about your mom very much. And I care about you. But we're taking things slowly because we both want to make sure we're doing what's right. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a judge. Okay. But you should know, if you're mean to my mom, I'll be very upset with you. That's fair, Alexander agreed solemnly. After dinner they walked through the park. Emma ran ahead, chasing early fireflies while Sophie and Alexander followed at a slower pace. She threatened you, Sophie said, amusement coloring her voice. She's protective. I respect that. Sophie stopped walking, turning to face him. Alexander, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. Always. When your name is cleared, and Margaret seems confident it will be, what happens to us? You'll have opportunities again. Consulting, speaking engagements, maybe even starting a new company. You'll be back in that world of penthouses and private jets. Where does that leave a waitress and her diabetic daughter? Alexander took her hands. Sophie, I'm never going back to that world. Not because I can't, but because I don't want to. That version of Alexander Grayson was hollow. He had everything and valued nothing. He couldn't see the people right in front of him. He gestured toward Emma, still chasing fireflies with pure joy. You and Emma taught me what actually matters. Honest work. Real relationships. Being present for the people you love. I'm not giving that up for anything. But the money? I don't need billions to be happy, Alexander interrupted gently. I need purpose. I need to know that what I'm doing helps people instead of exploiting them. I found that at Mel's. I found it with you. Sophie's eyes glistened in the streetlight. You really mean that? Every word. She kissed him then, soft and tentative, a promise of something neither of them wanted to rush but both felt growing steadily between them. Emma's voice carried across the park. I knew it. You are boyfriend and girlfriend. They broke apart laughing, and Alexander thought this ordinary moment in an ordinary park, was worth more than every empire he'd ever built. If you believe people like Marcus Brennan who destroy lives for profit deserve maximum prison sentences with no possibility of parole, hit that like button right now. Show that fraud, manipulation, and threatening innocent children should result in permanent consequences. Only those who excuse white-collar crime scroll past without engaging. 3 months into the appeal process, Alexander received an unexpected phone call. Dad. The voice hit him like electricity. Christina, his 18-year-old daughter, whom he hadn't spoken to since the day of his sentencing. Christina, Alexander breathed. I didn't think you'd ever call. I wasn't going to, she admitted, her voice carrying the hurt of abandonment and confusion. But then I saw the news about Marcus Brennan's arrest. About the new evidence. Mom said I shouldn't contact you, but I needed to hear it from you. Did he really frame you? Alexander sat down heavily on his narrow bed at the halfway house. Yes. But sweetheart, I'm still responsible. I should have been paying attention. I should have verified what Marcus was telling me. I was so focused on building the company that I stopped caring about the people the company was supposed to serve. So you're saying you're guilty and innocent at the same time? I'm saying I'm guilty of negligence and arrogance. Marcus is guilty of the actual fraud. Both things can be true. Christina was silent for a long moment. Where are you living now? A halfway house in Chicago. I work at a diner washing dishes and helping with the books. You? Washing dishes. Every day. It's honest work, Christina. I'm proud of it. Another pause. Can I see you? Alexander's throat tightened. You want to see me? I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Christina said carefully. But I think I need to understand who you are now. Because the dad I remember wouldn't wash dishes or live in a halfway house. He'd be fighting to get back on top. That dad was lost, Alexander said quietly. I'm trying to be someone better. They met the following Saturday at a coffee shop near Northwestern University, where Christina was finishing her freshman year. She looked so much like her mother, the same sharp eyes, the same guarded posture. But when she smiled tentatively at Alexander, he saw himself in her too. You look different, Christina said as they sat down with their coffees. Prison and manual labor will do that. Not just physically. You seem, I don't know, calmer? Less like you're about to conquer something. Alexander smiled. I spent 23 years conquering. It didn't make me happy. Now I'm just trying to be present. Christina stirred her coffee slowly. Tell me about the diner. So Alexander did. He told her about Mel, about Luis's fierce kindness, about the regulars who came in every morning. He told her about Sophie and Emma, about arranging insulin assistance, about learning to see people he'd been blind to his entire life. You're in love with her, Christina observed. This Sophie. I think I might be. Good. Christina's expression softened slightly. The dad I knew never talked about people the way you just talked about her. He talked about markets and acquisitions and competitors. You sounded actually human just now. I'm trying to be. They talked for 2 hours, carefully navigating the wreckage of their relationship. Christina didn't forgive him, not yet, but she agreed to keep meeting to slowly rebuild what had been broken. As they parted, Christina hugged him briefly. I'm glad you're becoming someone better, Dad. Just don't expect it to fix everything overnight. I won't, Alexander promised. I've learned patience. Marcus Brennan's trial began 5 months after his arrest, and it was everything Alexander's had been, except this time justice was aimed at the right target. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney David Martinez, systematically dismantled Marcus's defenses. Forensic accountants testified about the shell companies. Digital forensics experts traced Thomas Brennan's email accounts back to Marcus's old servers. Property developers admitted under oath that Marcus had manipulated them into paying inflated prices for land he'd intimidated owners into selling. Margaret Foster called Alexander as a witness. He took the stand wearing a simple suit Mel had helped him buy from a consignment shop, his hands still bearing the calluses from dishwashing. Mr. Grayson, Martinez began, tell the court about your relationship with the defendant. Alexander described their 7-year working relationship, how he'd trusted Marcus completely, how that trust had been weaponized against him. And after your release from prison, what happened when Marcus Brennan appeared at your workplace? Alexander recounted the intimidation, the threats against Emma, the systematic property acquisition scheme. During cross-examination, Marcus's attorney tried to paint Alexander as a vindictive ex-convict seeking revenge. Isn't it true, Mr. Grayson, that you blame my client for your own criminal negligence? No, Alexander said calmly. I blame your client for the crimes he committed. I blame myself for not paying enough attention to stop him. Both things are true. The answer seemed to deflate the attorney's strategy. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, identity fraud, securities fraud, witness intimidation, conspiracy. The judge, the same Judge Morrison who'd sentenced Alexander 2 years earlier, showed no mercy. Marcus Brennan, you have demonstrated a pattern of sophisticated fraud spanning over a decade. You destroyed thousands of lives, framed an innocent man, and showed no remorse whatsoever. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release. Marcus's face went white. 25 years meant he'd be 72 upon release. His entire future consumed by the consequences he'd evaded for so long. As marshals led him away, Marcus locked eyes with Alexander one final time. The malice was gone, replaced by hollow defeat. Alexander felt no triumph, only quiet relief. Justice wasn't revenge. It was restoration. 2 weeks after Marcus's sentencing, Alexander stood before Judge Morrison again, but this time Margaret Foster stood beside him with documents that would change everything. Your Honor, Margaret began, Based on newly discovered evidence and the conviction of Marcus Brennan for the fraud originally attributed to Mr. Grayson, we move to vacate Alexander Grayson's conviction and dismiss all charges. The prosecution didn't contest. David Martinez stood and said simply, "The United States agrees. Justice requires we acknowledge when we've convicted the wrong person." Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence in silence, her reading glasses perched on her nose. Finally she looked up. "Mr. Grayson, I sentenced you to 8 years for crimes I believed you committed. The evidence now shows that while you were negligent in your oversight, the actual fraud was perpetrated entirely by Marcus Brennan. Your conviction is hereby vacated. All charges are dismissed. You are a free man." The gavel fell with finality. Alexander stood there, feeling the weight of 2 years of shame and guilt lifting from his shoulders. He was no longer a convicted felon. His record would be expunged. His name finally was clear. Margaret shook his hand. "Congratulations. You're officially exonerated." "Thank you," Alexander said, his voice thick with emotion. "For believing me when nobody else did." "You made it easy," Margaret replied. "You never lied, never made excuses. You just kept being honest about your failures and working to become better. That's rare." Outside the courthouse, Sophie and Emma waited. When Alexander emerged, Sophie searched his face for the answer. "It's over," he said. "I'm cleared." Emma threw her arms around his waist. "Does this mean you're not in trouble anymore?" "That's exactly what it means, sweetheart." Sophie kissed him, tears of relief streaming down her face. "What happens now?" Alexander looked at the courthouse steps where 2 years ago he'd been led away in handcuffs. Now he stood free, surrounded by people who'd loved him without conditions. "Now," he said, "we go back to the diner. Mel's expecting me for the lunch shift." Second chances matter. If you believe Alexander Grayson earned his redemption through honest work and genuine change, let's show that transformation is real when people do the hard work of becoming better. Only those who believe people can't change stay silent. With his record cleared, Alexander had options he hadn't possessed since his arrest. Former colleagues reached out with consulting offers. Venture capital firms wanted his expertise. 3 different companies offered executive positions with 6-figure salaries. Alexander turned them all down. Instead, he used a small settlement from a lawsuit against Grayson Industries' former board to make a different kind of investment. He bought Mel's diner. Not to own it, but to protect it. The deed was placed in a trust with Mel as lifetime operator and Sophie as co-beneficiary. When Mel eventually retired, the diner would belong to Sophie and Emma, ensuring they'd never face financial insecurity again. "You didn't have to do this," Mel said when Alexander explained the arrangement. "Yes, I did," Alexander replied. "You gave me a job when nobody else would. You gave me dignity when I had none. This is just making sure the place that saved my life can't be taken away by developers or economic downturns." Mel embraced him, tears in the old man's eyes. "You're a good man, Grayson." "I'm trying to be." But Alexander's transformation went beyond personal redemption. It sparked something larger in the neighborhood. With Mel's diner secure, other small business owners approached Alexander for advice. The laundromat owner struggling with debt. The corner grocery facing pressure from corporate chains. The family-owned printing shop that couldn't compete with online services. Alexander helped them all, using his business expertise not to maximize profits but to ensure sustainability. He restructured debts, negotiated with suppliers, identified inefficiencies. He taught owners the same lessons he'd learned. Success wasn't about domination, it was about service. Within a year, the entire neighborhood had stabilized. Small businesses that had been weeks from closure were thriving. Property values increased, but the original owners remained, protected by the community trust Alexander had helped establish. Sophie, watching him pour himself into helping others, asked one evening, "Don't you ever miss the old life? The power, the prestige?" "Never," Alexander said honestly. "That life was built on extracting value from people. This life is built on creating value for people. One leaves you empty. The other fills you up." He proposed to Sophie on the anniversary of the day they'd met, 1 year after Marcus had walked into the diner and exposed Alexander's past. They were closing the diner together, Sophie wiping down tables while Alexander counted the register. Emma was at her grandmother's house for the evening. "Sophie," Alexander said, setting down the cash drawer. A year ago today my life was a wreck. I was a convicted felon washing dishes, carrying shame I thought I'd never escape. You weren't just those things, Sophie interrupted gently. No, but I thought I was. And then you showed me something I'd never understood. You showed me that worth isn't measured by what you own or control. It's measured by how you treat people when you have nothing to gain. He knelt, pulling out a simple ring, not expensive but chosen with care. You saw me when I was invisible. You believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. Will you marry me? Sophie's hands flew to her mouth, tears already streaming. Yes. God, yes. They married 3 months later in a small ceremony at the diner, surrounded by the community that had become their family. Mel officiated with a license he'd gotten online specifically for the occasion. Louisa catered with her famous tamales. Christina flew in from Northwestern, tears in her eyes as she watched her father marry someone who'd helped him become the man he should have been all along. Emma served as flower girl, her insulin pump hidden beneath a purple dress, her smile bright enough to light the entire room. As Alexander and Sophie exchanged vows, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. The fall from grace. The prison sentence. The dishes washed and lessons learned. The woman who'd shown him what truly mattered. I promise to see you, Alexander said during his vows, the words carrying weight only they fully understood. To never take you for granted. To build a life with you based on what we give, not what we take. I promise to believe in you, Sophie replied, even when you struggle to believe in yourself. To remind you that you're more than your worst mistakes. To build something real with you, something that can't be taken away. They kissed as husband and wife, and the diner erupted in applause. 2 years after his exoneration, Alexander stood before a congressional committee investigating white-collar crime and corporate fraud. Representative Maria Gonzalez, chair of the Financial Services Committee, had invited him to testify about his experience, both as a victim of fraud and as someone who'd been wrongfully convicted. Mr. Grayson, Representative Gonzalez began, you've lived on both sides of our financial system. What changes do you believe are necessary to prevent cases like yours? Alexander took a breath, looking at the assembled representatives and the cameras broadcasting his testimony nationwide. The system currently rewards extraction over creation, he said. Companies are incentivized to maximize shareholder value at any cost, including the cost of human dignity. I built Grayson Industries on that philosophy, and it created the environment where Marcus Brennan's fraud could flourish. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But I've also learned that another way is possible. Small businesses like the diner where I work prioritize people over profits. They create value for communities, not just shareholders. We need policies that support that model. Tax incentives for employee-owned businesses, stronger protections against corporate consolidation, real accountability for white-collar criminals. You're advocating for fundamental restructuring of capitalism, one skeptical representative observed. I'm advocating for capitalism with conscience, Alexander corrected. Free markets can work, but only when they're designed to serve people, not exploit them. My experience taught me that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And any system that treats it as negotiable will eventually collapse. His testimony went viral. Clips were shared millions of times across social media. Business schools invited him to lecture. But Alexander's favorite response came from Emma, now 9 years old and thriving on her free insulin. You were on TV, she said matter-of-factly when he returned home. My teacher showed the class. She said you're a hero. I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just someone who learned from mistakes. That's what heroes do, Emma said with the simple wisdom of children. They mess up and then fix it. 5 years after washing his first dish at Mel's Diner, Alexander Grayson stood in that same diner, now expanded to include a community center in the space next door. The center offered free financial literacy classes, small business consulting, and job training for people re-entering society after incarceration. Alexander taught the business classes himself, sharing lessons learned from both his failures and his redemption. Sophie ran the administrative side, her experience managing chaos at the diner translating perfectly to nonprofit coordination. Emma, now 12 and entering middle school, volunteered on weekends, helping other kids whose families struggled with medical expenses understand they weren't alone. Mel had semi-retired, spending mornings at the diner greeting regulars and afternoons at the community center mentoring young entrepreneurs. Christina visited every month, their relationship fully restored. She'd chosen to study social work at Northwestern, inspired by watching her father's transformation from corporate titan to community servant. On this particular evening, Alexander was preparing for a special event. The Grayson Miller Community Center, named for both his and Sophie's families, was hosting its first annual Second Chance Dinner, a fundraiser supporting formerly incarcerated individuals seeking employment. The diner filled with people from every part of Alexander's journey. Margaret Foster, the attorney who'd cleared his name. James Chin, who'd arranged Emma's insulin and connected Alexander to the resources that helped expose Marcus. Former inmates Alexander had befriended at FCI Greenville, now working honest jobs and rebuilding their lives. Warden Patricia Hayes attended, now retired but still passionate about rehabilitation over punishment. "You proved what I always believed," she told Alexander, "that people aren't defined by their worst moments. They're defined by what they do after." As Alexander stood to address the crowd, he looked around the diner that had saved his life. The cracked vinyl booths had been reupholstered but kept their vintage charm. The jukebox still didn't work. The coffee still smelled slightly burnt. But it was home. "5 years ago," Alexander began, "I stood in a federal courtroom and heard a judge sentence me to 8 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit but was responsible for through negligence and arrogance." The room fell silent. "I lost everything. My company, my wealth, my family, my freedom. And I thought my life was over." He gestured towards Sophie, sitting with Emma. "But then I met people who taught me that life isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you contribute. It's about seeing the invisible people our society overlooks. It's about using whatever skills you have, even if it's just washing dishes, to serve others." His voice grew stronger. "Marcus Brennan tried to destroy me twice. He succeeded in taking my empire. But he couldn't take the thing that actually mattered, my capacity to change, to grow, to become someone worth respecting." Alexander pulled out a photograph, holding it up for the crowd. It showed him on his first day at Mel's, tired, defeated, wearing a stained apron, holding a mop. "This is who I was. Broken. Invisible. Starting over from nothing." He put down that photo and held up another. This one from yesterday, showing him teaching a financial literacy class to a room full of formerly incarcerated individuals. "This is who I am now. Still broken in some ways, still learning. But trying to help others find the second chances I was given." The applause started slowly, then built to a standing ovation. After the event, as Alexander and Sophie cleaned up together, a ritual they'd maintained even after hiring staff, she asked, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Marcus hadn't framed you? If you just kept being the billionaire CEO?" Alexander thought about it honestly. "I'd probably still be in that tower, accumulating wealth I didn't need, ignoring people I should have valued, becoming more isolated and miserable with every success." He wrapped his arms around her. "Marcus thought he was destroying me. But he accidentally gave me the greatest gift, the chance to lose everything and discover what actually matters. Which is this. Emma. This community. Work that helps instead of exploits. Relationships based on who I am, not what I own. Purpose that extends beyond my own ego." Sophie kissed him softly. "The world needs more failed billionaires like you." Alexander laughed. "I prefer reformed billionaire. Either way, you're mine. Always." Hit subscribe if you believe Alexander's story proves that real redemption requires action, not just words. Show that second chances should go to those who do the hard work of transformation, not those who make excuses. Only people who don't believe in genuine change won't subscribe. 10 years after his exoneration, Alexander Grayson had become something he'd never imagined during his corporate empire days, a voice for the voiceless. His testimony before Congress had led to the Second Chance Employment Act, legislation requiring companies receiving federal contracts to implement fair hiring practices for people with criminal records. The law had helped over 100,000 formerly incarcerated individuals find employment in its first 5 years. The Grayson Miller Community Centers had expanded to 12 cities, each one offering job training, financial literacy, and support services for people rebuilding their lives after incarceration, medical bankruptcy, or economic hardship. Sophie had become the CEO of the entire organization, her experience managing chaos translating into brilliant nonprofit leadership. Under her direction, the centers had helped 47,000 individuals find employment, secure housing, or start small businesses. Emma, now 17 and preparing for college, had started a national advocacy organization for children with chronic illnesses, fighting to make insulin and other life-saving medications affordable and accessible. Her TEDx talk, The Price of Staying Alive, had been viewed 8.3 million times. Christina worked as a social worker in Chicago's public defender's office, helping families navigate the same criminal justice system that had once wrongly convicted her father. Mel had passed away peacefully 2 years earlier, leaving the diner to Sophie with a note that read, "You saved this place by saving the man who helped me save it. Keep feeding people. Not just their stomachs but their souls." And Alexander, at 57 years old, had found something worth more than the billions he'd once commanded. He'd found peace. He still worked at the original Mel's Diner 3 days a week, serving coffee and washing dishes, never wanting to forget where he'd learned to see people. The other 4 days were spent teaching, mentoring, and advocating for criminal justice reform. On the 10-year anniversary of his exoneration, Alexander was invited to give the commencement address at Northwestern University, Christina's graduation ceremony. Standing before thousands of graduates and their families, Alexander shared the story one final time. "I built a multi-billion-dollar empire by the time I was 44, he said. "I had everything society tells us defines success: money, power, prestige, influence. And I was miserable, though I didn't know it." He paused, looking at Christina in the front row, her proud smile breaking through years of healed wounds. "Then I lost it all. Framed for crimes I didn't commit, stripped of everything I'd accumulated, sent to prison as a convicted felon. Society said my life was over." His voice grew stronger. "But in that prison cell, washing dishes in a diner, being invisible to the world that had once courted my favor, I learned the truth our culture desperately needs to understand. Your worth isn't determined by what you own, control, or achieve. It's determined by how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them." The graduates leaned forward, engaged in ways commencement speakers rarely achieved. "A waitress named Sophie saw me when I was invisible. A diner owner named Mel gave me a job when nobody else would. A little girl with diabetes taught me that the most important work we can do is helping others survive and thrive. They didn't save me because I was important. They helped me because helping is who they are." Alexander's eyes swept across the crowd. "You're graduating into a world that will tell you success means accumulation. Get the high-paying job. Buy the luxury car. Climb the corporate ladder. Prove you're better than everyone else." He shook his head. "I'm here to tell you that's a lie. Real success means contribution. It means seeing the people our society renders invisible. It means using your talents to serve, not to dominate. It means understanding that we're all one catastrophe away from needing the kindness we should be showing others right now." The audience was completely silent. 10 years ago, I was exonerated of crimes I didn't commit. But here's what I learned. Legal innocence and moral innocence are different things. I was legally innocent of fraud, but morally guilty of negligence, of arrogance, of building systems that exploited people. The real work of redemption wasn't clearing my name, it was becoming someone worth respecting. He gestured toward the graduates. "So my challenge to you is this: don't wait for catastrophe to teach you what matters. Don't build empires on exploitation. Don't make people invisible because they can't advance your agenda. See them now. Help them now. Build systems that serve humanity, not just your own ambition." The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. Afterward, Christina embraced her father, tears streaming down both their faces. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she whispered. "I'm proud of the woman you've become," Alexander replied. "You're everything I should have been when I was your age." "You're everything I want to be now," Christina corrected. "Someone who learns from mistakes, who helps others, who chooses people over power." That evening, Alexander and Sophie sat on the small balcony of their modest apartment, the same one Sophie had lived in when they met, which they'd kept despite being able to afford much more. Emma was inside finishing her homework. The sounds of the neighborhood, children playing, music drifting from open windows, life happening, created a symphony more beautiful than anything Alexander's old penthouse had offered. "Do you ever miss it?" Sophie asked the same question she'd asked years before. "The wealth, the influence?" "Never," Alexander said, meaning it more deeply than he ever had. I have everything that matters right here. He thought about Marcus Brennan, now 12 years into his 25-year sentence, and felt no satisfaction in his enemy's suffering, only sadness that Marcus had never learned what Alexander had discovered, that the only thing worth having is what you give away. The city lights twinkled below them, each one representing a person with their own struggles, dreams, and capacity for both failure and redemption. Alexander had once tried to conquer this city. Now he just wanted to serve it. And that, he finally understood, was the difference between a life wasted and a life lived. Tap like if Alexander and Sophie's story proves that falling to the bottom can be the beginning of rising to your true purpose. Show that real wealth is measured in lives changed, not dollars accumulated. Only those who still worship money over meaning scroll past without engaging. 15 years after washing his first dish at Mel's Diner, Alexander Grayson sat in that same establishment, now officially renamed Mel's Place, a community table. The diner had become more than a restaurant. It was a movement, a philosophy, proof that business could prioritize people over profit and still thrive. Sophie had just returned from Washington, D.C., where she testified before Congress about the success of their community center model. The federal government was considering nationwide funding for similar programs. Emma was finishing her sophomore year at Harvard Medical School, specializing in endocrinology with the goal of making diabetes treatment accessible to everyone, not just those who could afford it. Christina ran a nonprofit legal clinic providing free representation to people wrongfully convicted, helping others find the justice Alexander had found. And Marcus Brennan had just been denied parole for the third time. The parole board cited his continued refusal to accept responsibility for his crimes. He would serve his full sentence. Alexander felt no joy in Marcus's continued imprisonment. He'd long ago stopped defining himself in opposition to the man who'd framed him. Marcus's fate was simply the consequence of choices made. Justice delivered, nothing more. I got a call today, Sophie said, sliding into the booth across from Alexander. From the White House. Alexander looked up from the schedule he was reviewing. The White House. They want you to serve on a presidential commission studying criminal justice reform and economic inequality. The opportunity was enormous. A chance to influence policy at the highest levels, to create systemic change that could help millions. What did you tell them? Alexander asked. That I'd discuss it with my husband and get back to them. Alexander thought about it for a long moment. Then he smiled. Tell them I'll do it under one condition, that I continue working at this diner 3 days a week. No exceptions. Sophie laughed. You want to wash dishes and advise the president? I want to remember where I learned everything that matters, Alexander corrected. The day I stop seeing the people in this diner as my priority is the day I've forgotten who I am. I'll let them know, Sophie said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Through the diner windows they could see the neighborhood they'd helped transform. Small businesses thriving. Children playing safely. People of all backgrounds working together. This was Alexander's empire now. Not towers of glass and steel, but communities of flesh and blood. Not billions extracted, but lives enriched. Not domination, but service. He thought about the journey, from corporate titan to convicted felon to dishwasher to community leader. Every step necessary. Every loss leading to something found. A young couple entered the diner, looking nervous and overwhelmed. The woman was visibly pregnant. The man carried the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone working multiple jobs. Alexander recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror during his darkest days. He stood, grabbing menus. Welcome to Mel's Place. Sit anywhere you'd like. Coffee's fresh and today's special is on me. The couple looked at him with the same confusion Alexander had felt when Mel had first shown him kindness. The inability to understand why a stranger would help. Why? The young man asked. Alexander smiled, thinking about Sophie, about Mel, about everyone who'd helped him when he had nothing to offer in return. Because someone helped me when I needed it, he said simply. And that's what we do here. We see each other. We help each other. We remember that we're all just people trying to survive and maybe, if we're lucky, make things a little better for whoever comes after us. As Alexander poured their coffee, he caught his reflection in the window. Not the powerful CEO who'd once commanded billions. Not the broken ex-con washing dishes in shame. Just a man who'd learned to see, to serve, to be present for people who needed someone to believe in them. This was who Alexander Grayson had become. And finally, after all the empires built and lost, after all the failures and redemptions, he was enough. The diner filled with the familiar sounds, conversations, laughter, dishes clattering, life happening. Alexander moved through it all with the practiced ease of someone who'd found his purpose in the most unexpected place. At closing time, as he and Sophie locked up together, Alexander paused to look around one more time. "Thank you," he whispered to the empty diner, to Mel's memory, to the journey that had broken him down and built him back up as someone worth being. "For what?" Sophie asked. "For showing me that sometimes you have to lose everything to find what matters. That the bottom isn't the end, it's the beginning of understanding what it means to be human." Sophie kissed him softly. "Come on, reformed billionaire. Emma's waiting for us at home." They walked out into the Chicago night, hand in hand, two people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. The diner lights dimmed behind them, but the impact of what happened there, the lives changed, the dignity restored, the invisible people finally seen, would ripple outward for generations. This wasn't a story about a billionaire who lost everything. It was a story about a man who lost everything and discovered that everything he'd been chasing was never what he needed at all. It was a story about second chances earned through honest work and genuine transformation. It was a story about a waitress who saw worth in someone the world had deemed worthless. And it was a story that proved over and over that the greatest wealth isn't measured in billions. It's measured in the quiet grace of being seen, the simple power of helping others, and the profound peace of finally becoming someone you can respect. Alexander Grayson had built empires and lost them. But in a small diner on the corner of Madison and Wells, serving coffee to strangers and washing dishes with calloused hands, he'd found something worth infinitely more. He'd found himself. And that was the greatest success of all. This has been a story from Blissful Whispers, where we don't just share tales of redemption and transformation. We document the truth that people are never beyond saving, that second chances are real when earned through genuine change, and that the invisible people in our lives often teach us the most valuable lessons. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that falling isn't failure and that true success is measured in lives enriched rather than wealth accumulated, share it with someone who needs to hear that transformation is possible. Because in the end, we're all just people trying to figure out what matters. Some of us learn early. Others, like Alexander, need to lose everything first. But the lesson is always the same. See people, serve others, and understand that dignity isn't negotiable. Thank you for journeying with us through Alexander and Sophie's story. At Blissful Whispers, we believe the most powerful stories are those that remind us of our shared humanity, the capacity for both failure and redemption that lives in every heart. Subscribe to Blissful Whispers for more stories that strip away pretense and reveal the truth, that we're all capable of change, that kindness creates ripples we can't predict, and that sometimes the greatest gift is simply being seen by someone who believes we're worth saving. Where are you in your journey? Are you building empires or building character? Are you accumulating or contributing? Drop your thoughts in the comments because your story matters too. This has been Blissful Whispers, where truth speaks louder than wealth, where transformation trumps perfection, where every voice, every story, every second chance deserves to be heard.